Hey everybody, it's Magic Prepper, and I want to share a firearms mistake that wasted my time and money with you, so that way you can avoid doing the same thing in the future. When it comes to preparedness, we should be prioritizing reliability, durability, and function over all else for our equipment selection regarding firearms and accessories. However, every so often we make the mistake of doing the exact opposite. And that's because I didn't have a system in place. So I'm going to share that system with you in this video that'll help you make appropriate decisions when it comes to equipment selection. And it's definitely a process I suggest you go through, so that way we're not wasting money or time or energy on things that don't really make sense. Now, before we can do that, we have to make a couple of admissions and be a little bit understanding of our personal capabilities. So first off, personally, I don't have the budget or the equipment to properly test brand new gear to the point of trusting it. Now, what that means is that I just can't afford the ammunition, and I don't have all the specialty tools to be able to take a brand new firearm or accessory and put it through the ringer and decide that yes, it is in fact completely reliable. So there's some things that we're going to talk about here in a second regarding how we can avoid that or mitigate some of that risk, but that's just my personal situation and I have to be honest about it. Another thing to consider and be understanding of is that fully matured tech should take priority. When I say that, what I mean is fully matured technology is technology that's been vetted and been used and has proven itself to be reliable in many different conditions and environments. So that's something that we should always be considering when we're trying to select equipment. And we shouldn't want to be the beta testers, which I have been many times. Now, another thing to consider and to be understanding of is that new products are not as good as product improvements or product improved. Now, these are things that are improved incrementally based off of core designs that we know for a fact work properly. And that's something that you can trust more than something that's brand new, but there are still ways to try to mitigate some risk when it comes to those brand new items. But that's just something that we should also be honest about and understanding of when it comes to trying to figure out what to put on our rifle or what type of rifle to have or anything along those lines. So we're gonna get into the system, and I'm gonna give you the complete overview of how to use it and what process to go through when you're trying to make those decisions, which I have been using, which has helped me quite a bit, as soon as we get a word in from our sponsor. This video's sponsor is TacPack. TacPack is a monthly subscription service where you get tactical gear you didn't even know existed that you can try out and stock up on additional parts at the same time. There's two different monthly subscription tiers. You have the standard at $60 a month and the plus at $140 a month. And it includes things like Enforce weapon-mounted lights. This is a Gen 3 with IR and white light. Mantis dry fire systems to get better while you don't have to expend ammunition. Also have survival gear like this SOG camp knife. You also get things like Fab Defense bipods, which is something I didn't even know existed, but seems pretty intense. And then of course fun stuff too, like stickers. And right now, if you use the code MAGIC while signing up for the Plus subscription, you'll get a free $70 tactical gift, which will make your first box have a value of up to $400. And brands like Battle Arms Development, 9line, Next Level Armament, and more are included in TacPacks. So check out TacPack.com and sign up for the Plus membership with the code MAGIC to support the channel, get a lot of really cool stuff mailed right to your door every month, and of course, support an awesome company. All right, big thanks to TacPack for supporting the channel. Now here is the system to determine equipment selection. And this has saved me a lot of time and money, so hopefully it can help you too. Now this is all through the lens of preparedness, so keep that in mind as we go through, because if you're worried about 3-gun or PRS or anything else, it's not necessarily going to apply in the same fashion, all right? Now, I do have some examples of the equipment selection that I have made here to build context and to give you some insight into my thought process. So I want to make sure that, this is clear and safe, so we can talk about that and just to give you some things to consider, all right? Now, the first step of this system is realistic assessment of need. And this is an interesting one. And I think me switching from an LPVO back to an ACOG is a great example of this. So we'll use that as we move forward. Now, realistic assessment of need means a couple of things. First off, what do you need for your purposes, your area, and skill level? That's a question that you need to ask. And when it comes to that, what are some of the answers that we're likely going to hear? Well, I want to be able to defend myself, defend my home, possibly defend my community. So of course, in that situation, you want to pick something that makes sense for being able to do that. So a fighting rifle would be maybe an AR-15 or an AK platform, or something that's proven and available and capable of doing that particular role. The same thing could be said about a handgun, right? So we'll go ahead, clear this, okay? So this is a Glock 45, right? 9mm, double stack, modern polymer striker fired pistol. A great option for the same concept if a handgun makes more sense for what you're trying to do. Now, if that's your purpose, the same thing can be applied to the accessories, okay? Well, I want to be able to defend my home. All right, well, you know, usually you can do that with a red dot sight pretty well, possibly even iron sights. But I also want to be able to defend my property. Okay, well, depending on how big your property is, you might need a little bit of magnification. Well, and I want to defend my community and possibly my country from tyranny. Okay, well, now we're talking about needing something a little bit more robust and with a little bit more magnification, or at least a level of reticle that allows you to reach out further, right? So there's a lot of considerations there, but those are the things that you have to be thinking about before you make these decisions. So what's the purpose, right? And so for this particular rifle, it's pretty much all of the above. Defend my home, defend my property, defend my community, defend my nation, right? That's the idea behind this gun, and I think it can do all those things very well. Now, what about your area, okay? You live in an urban environment, your requirements are going to be different than mine where I live in a rural environment. I have 400-yard sight lines right here on my own property. So that means that magnification becomes a little bit more important, not necessarily the priority, but more important. Whereas if you are in an urban environment or in an apartment building or something along those lines, it's possible that you can get by with just a red dot sight and generally take care of anything that you might encounter. So these are considerations you also need to make. And then skill level. And this is where you really have to be honest with yourself. And that's the second part of realistic assessment of need, is that honesty is required and it all has to be looked at through a lens of realism, okay? So your skill level is something you have to be honest about. You can buy a high-end LPVO, like a Night Force Attacker, let's say. And it's going to be great, have great glass, have a great reticle, be very usable in many different situations. But if your skill level doesn't allow you to be on target with a simple red dot sight, why are we jumping into something much more complicated that requires a level of training and skill in order to be properly efficient with? And that's something that you have to ask yourself and be realistic about with yourself. And the same can be said about certain firearms platforms. In all honesty, at least from personal experience, an AR-15 is easier to manipulate and use for a more novice shooter than an AK platformed rifle, just because of the manual of arms and the way everything works and some antiquated concepts regarding the AK versus the AR. So I know the AK crowd is freaking out on me right now, but that's just from my personal experience, all right? So you have to make these decisions within your skill level and be aware of what it is you're actually capable of. And I think we all have to be honest about what not only we're capable of, but also what's realistic. And realistically, there's not a lot of situations that are going to arise for me personally, either on my property or in my community, where a 4X ACOG isn't going to be capable of dealing with a threat. There are some scenarios I could come up with where it might not be as much as I would like to have, but there aren't many scenarios I can think of where it wouldn't be capable of being part of whatever it is that has suddenly arisen. So that is the realistic assessment of need that is required. You have to look at that first in order to make sure that what you're getting makes sense and you're using the purposes, the area, and the skill level to really dictate whether or not the things you're looking at are required. The other thing to keep in mind is that honesty thing is hard for people to do, myself included at times. And every so often I have to recognize that, yes, I might have a nice high-end optic that can reach out very far and have great magnification and a good reticle. But how often do I shoot at longer ranges? And personally, not as much as I would like. So that then makes me consider whether or not a high magnification rifle scope is the right choice, right? All things that we have to be thinking about. Now, let's talk about the second step here, okay? And this is going to be where the examples become a little bit more interesting, all right? Risk assessment is number 2. Now, what is risk assessment in regards to this particular system, all right? We want to lower our risk as much as humanly possible when it comes to the equipment we are selecting. This is where things get into the territory of buying things from reputable manufacturers or things that may be slightly more expensive but generally have better quality control or materials or whatever it might be. We're lowering the risk of what we have control over in order to avoid potential problems in the future. So the first part of risk assessment is understanding that Legacy items generally have lower risk. What are legacy items, okay? So a legacy item would be something that's been around for a very long time, that's well vetted, has a large logistics chain, and is proven to be reliable and usable for the intended purpose. So, I mean, you could apply that to things like the 1911. You could apply that to things like Glock pistols, right? So you have a Glock pistol. This is a Gen 5, a little bit newer, but it's built off a legacy design that's been around for 40 plus years. So those are considerations that you should be aware of. Generally, things that have been around a long time and are still around and still being used are a good bet. AR-15, another good example of this, right? So, legacy is generally lower risk. Now, the next part of this is improved upon designs are usually less risk than brand new designs. Let's talk about that a little bit further, especially using some of our examples here, okay? This is a ACOG. Trijicon ACOG TA02. This is not necessarily a legacy item, but it's built off of a legacy item. So this is an improved upon design. They took the legacy ACOG TA31, they added an LED emitter with a control knob in order to have the brightness level you desire, while using a AA battery to power it, getting long battery life, but maintaining the core principles of the ACOG. Durability, lightweight, small footprint, very robust, right? And of course the reticles and everything else there within. That is what an improved upon design is. This is not a brand new optic that nobody has ever heard of before. This is a legacy optic that has some modernization added to it in order to make it more feasible for the, I guess we'll say, current battlefield, right? Which I'm not law enforcement, I am not military, I am just a prepared citizen. So saying that feels cringe at times. Now, if you ever feel cringe, hit the subscribe button down below because that was my opportunity to be even more cringe. Now, the same thing can be said about the red dot optic on top. This is a Trijicon RCR. This is the enclosed version of the RMR. Now the RMR is probably the most tested, most reliable and durable pistol optic that we currently have. That's just the reality of it. The RCR is that design, but enclosed. So even though it's newer, it's still that's how you use words, an improved upon design on a legacy device that has the track record and the engineering behind it, not to mention the manufacturer behind it, to then say that, yes, this is a little bit better than what we used to have, but it isn't brand new and it isn't completely untested in that regard. So the risk assessment here is that we're relying on the fact that the manufacturer has been doing this for a long time. They've had a very good track record with their legacy products, and all they've done is improve them slightly to make them a little bit more versatile. And for me, I need an enclosed red dot optic on a rifle setup because where I live, I shoot a lot in the snow and in the rain and in the dust, and it actually does make a difference for not having that reticle occluded suddenly at the worst opportune time. Now, the next section of risk assessment is going to be mitigating risk when it comes to a couple of restrictions, okay? You can limit risk with budget-friendly or new product-related items by making some better decisions, okay? So, let's talk about that here right now, okay? Here we have a USP. I deleted the decocker, don't worry. A USP 45, okay? This one's from Langdon Tactical, and I like it a lot. Here I have an Acro P2. This is an Aimpoint Acro P2 red dot optic, okay? This is an enclosed optic. I have already stated that I prefer enclosed red dot optics for the reasons aforementioned. Now, this is not necessarily my #1 choice of enclosed red dot optic. Why? Because the RCR is most likely a better red dot in the sense of durability, longevity, and electronics. And that's because it was built off of the RMR. It has that legacy and track record with minor improvements. Aimpoint has not been making enclosed red dot optics for as long. And although they do a relatively good job, there have been some issues, okay? So this is one of those items where I can mitigate some of those potential risks of it being a newer product and from a manufacturer that's very reputable and very good, but just hasn't been in the pistol optic game for as long. I can mitigate some of the risk here because of their very high level of customer service and their reputation as a manufacturer. So although it's very expensive, and although there have been some reported issues, by having this optic over many other unknown or brand new designs, it allows me to mitigate some of that additional risk from where I could have maybe had something like the RCR. Now, just to kind of give you some insight here, the reason I don't have an RCR on this is because the Langdon Tactical optic mounting plates don't interface with the Trijicon RCR because of the way they use the recoil studs and the way that the RMR footprint works for their system. It's not compatible with the RCR, or I would have probably gone that route. So because I was forced to choose this particular footprint in order to have an enclosed optic, I decided to go with one that mitigates additional risk by having very high customer service and a reputation as a manufacturer. And that's Aimpoint, of course. Now, I haven't had any issues with this Acro P2 other than one dead battery when I left it out in negative 40 degrees for a very long time, which is outside of its operating range, which makes sense. So honestly, no real problems with the Acro P2 for me, but I have seen them reported. The reason I went through that whole rigmarole is to kind of give you some guidance as to what happens when you're forced to make a decision about something that isn't necessarily your ideal decision, but compromises are the name of the game when it comes to firearms and accessories. And in this particular instance, in order to get an enclosed optic, I had to go with an Acro footprint. Now, I could have gone with the Steiner MPS as well, which I've heard very good things about, but I went with the Aimpoint, and here we are. And of course, that risk is mitigated from that reputation and customer service. And the same thing can be said about companies like HoloSun, in all honesty. HoloSun, they're riskier. Why? Because they're more budget friendly. They generally aren't going to have as good quality control in order to hit those price points. And they're a newer product and a newer manufacturer, right? And of course, the country of origin can be questionable sometimes as well. But with that being said, HoloSun has excellent customer service. So even if something goes wrong, they will take care of you, which mitigates some of the risk of using their optics, which is why they're one of the brands that I'm still willing to support and purchase, right? So that hopefully explains risk with budget or new items and how you can mitigate it in a couple of different ways, especially when you're forced to make a decision that isn't necessarily what you wanted to make. Now, okay, there's one more thing when it comes to risk assessment that we just discussed, but I just wanted to make sure to touch on it, is limitation requirements. When you're forced to make a decision based on the platform you're using or based on the firearm that you have to acquire, maybe you're a professional and so you have to use a certain firearm for duty or whatever it might be. When you are forced to use something based on a certain level of limitation requirements, then you just have to mitigate as much risk as possible by ensuring that anything else related to it meets the criteria that you have, okay? So hopefully that explains that a little bit further. Now, let's talk about one more level of this system that you have to consider before just making purchases willy-nilly. That was the slowest fly I've ever seen. All right, the third step of the system is budgetary assessment, okay? And this is not just, can you afford an ACOG? Can you afford a BCM? Can you afford a USP or a Glock or whatever, right? This is a little bit deeper than that, okay? The first part of budgetary assessment is, what can you actually afford that has the lowest amount of risk? So, if you can't afford a Glock, right? If you can't afford a Glock, even though it's probably one of the best pistols out there in the sense of logistics, parts, maintenance, in the sense of ease of use, and reliability, if you can't afford a Glock, there are other good options out there that are more affordable. But that's where you need to start mitigating more risk by choosing reputable manufacturers and ensuring that what you're getting is reliable, either through lots of research or personal testing, okay? So what can you actually afford that has low risk? And honestly, this applies heavily to optics. ACOGs are expensive. We all know that. If your budget is like $100 or $200, I wouldn't even consider anything magnified. That's just my honest opinion, because there is a level of risk that you're taking with anything that has magnified glass inside of it that's at that level of price. But we are in a time, which I'm glad to say, where you can get a red dot optic for 100 to 200 bucks that will actually work and doesn't have much risk at all. And so that's something that you really need to consider with your budgetary assessment. Even if you go back to what do you need for your purposes, area, and skill level in the first section of realistic assessment of need, and you decide you need something like an LPVO, let's say, but then you come back to budgetary assessment and realize that you can really only spend about 100 bucks on an optic, that's where you need to then say, for now, a red dot sight is probably my best option because I can actually afford one that has lower amounts of risk. Whereas an LPVO in that price range is the highest amount of risk that you can possibly acquire in that type of optic. And the same can be said about the firearms of choice and things of that nature. Luckily, budgetary assessment, what can you actually afford that has low risk? Well, generally AR-15s. Now you can get AR-15s cheap enough where there's still gonna be some risk, but if you get it from a good manufacturer, they will take care of you if there's a problem, which means, you know, at least you can try to get it figured out. And of course, there's a lot of brands out there that can do that. Palmetto State Armory, I know, has helped me in the past when it comes to having to repair a product that I received that wasn't necessarily correct when I received it, but thankfully thereafter, they took care of the problem and we got everything up and running. So keep those things in mind, okay? The other part of budgetary assessment is, can you afford to train to a level of efficiency? Now, this one is something that you have to be very honest about. And this is definitely true when it comes to avoiding buying equipment that you're not going to be able to use in any type of real form or fashion, right? So what can you afford to train with to the point where you're going to be good with it? Well, if you can only afford to go to the indoor range once a month and shoot at 25-yard targets, then having a 3-18 first focal plane optic is probably not the right choice, right? If you can only afford to shoot 100 rounds of ammo per year, then you need to give yourself the best possible option for being able to get on target quickly and actually have that muscle memory for dealing with a threat, right? Like, these are things you have to be real honest about. Having a complicated reticle or a complicated system when you barely get to shoot it all in the first place is probably not a good choice, okay? If you never get to shoot at 500 yards, why are you concerned about an optic that can get you to 500 yards? Sure, it can if you need it to, I guess, but if you've never practiced that or you don't get to do it regularly, what's the likelihood of it actually helping in that situation? I would say very, very low. If you can't effectively or efficiently shoot an AR-15 with a red dot sight at 25 yards and be on target quickly, why are we jumping into anything else, in all honesty, right? I've made that mistake. I made the mistake of having all this additional equipment when I couldn't even actually shoot very well with the basics, right? And I mean, we can apply that to you know, iron sights if you want. So budgetary assessment matters because it's not just, can you afford the piece of gear you want? Can you afford the piece of gear you want and afford to actually learn how to use it and afford to push the boundaries as to what it's capable of? Because there's so many people out there that have 1 to 8 LPVOs and never even shoot further than 100 yards. And so, yes, I understand that it could definitely help you if you get into a situation where you need to shoot further than that. It could definitely help you make a lower hit probability, you know, chance of making it happen. Sorry, I can't talk when something's biting me. I can understand that it could help you make a more precise shot, is the real word I was trying to say there. Those things are definitely worth considering. But if you can never actually shoot it to what it's made for and for what makes it worth owning, then why have it in the first place? You need to train with your equipment, and if you're limited on how you can train by your environment or your area, then do what's best for that so you can be as efficient as possible with what you have access to, not just because you might need it one day even though you've never done that or tried it before, right? So one more time to quickly run through the 3 steps of the system that helps you determine whether or not you need something and will save you time and money, okay? Realistic assessment of need, risk assessment, and then budgetary assessment. And once you go through those 3 processes, you'll find very quickly that the thing you thought you wanted, you might not actually need. And you'll also find, I didn't like that thing, you'll also find that you basically, well, probably have already wasted money and have already made some bad choices. Because that's where I was at, and that's what I learned the hard way. And even though I live in rural North Dakota, and even though I've got 400-yard sight lines right here on my own property, 4X ACOG makes the most sense for me because it's covers my purposes, my area, and most importantly, my skill level. And it also has very low risk. Not to mention, I could afford it, and I can afford to train with it because I can shoot at 200 or 300 yards pretty regularly, but not 600 or 1,000. So, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I really wanted to have this conversation to try to help all of you make better decisions because it's something I've had to go through the hard way. And if I didn't have to do that, I'd be sitting a little bit prettier in my bank account at this point in time. And of course, if you want to support the channel, make sure you go to magicprepper.com, where you can make another financial decision regarding the MP Field Tool, which is a product that I released here recently. It's made in the USA. It has a ton of versatility for using it with your rifles and everything else. And whatever that was biting me, could probably be removed with the MP Field Tool if needed. So make sure you check that out because it really goes to help support the channel while getting you a product that's actually useful and helps the US economy. Anything else you need from me at all, you know what to do. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.